This lesson is on appropriation budgets in UEN. Please turn to your UEN New Client Handbook to page 26. Now I'm going to start with some important qualifiers here before we get into this lesson. Number one, as I mentioned with the in the revenue budget section, for those of you who are converting, for these exercises in this section, we are assuming that our Buckeye Township entity, our township, is a current UEN customer. We're assuming that it's about January of 2011 and that Buckeye Township has been on using the UEN software for at least the past year or so. And so when they close their 2010 books in UEN, they're just rolling over into 2011 and setting up their new budgets. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this before, your account codes will, when you close a year, your account codes for, like for instance, appropriation or revenue account codes, they will carry over from year to year. You don't have to activate or set up account codes for the first time every year, but you do have to enter in an annual revenue and appropriation budget on a yearly basis. That does get wiped out from year to year, and you have to enter that on a regular basis. And that's intentional. That's per audit division would, at our state, they would like it that way. They want you to think through your budgets and key them in. So be aware of that. We'll get into some of the, now most of this of course is going to be the same as for those of you converting, but there are some particular, the amounts that you put in there might vary depending on which one of the four conversion methods that you pick. So we'll touch base on that in that lecture. All right, my second qualifier is that we're going to be talking about budgets and touch on a little bit on the law regarding the appropriation budgets. Just as with revenues, and as I mentioned at the beginning of this class, UEN, we're the software people, and so this is accounting software, but we don't look to these lessons as the authority on a particular, how do you prepare this information, or some our examples as authoritative. They are relevant, and you should use the tools, but as far as for questions on how you should set up your appropriation ordinance or resolution, you want to take a look at, if you have any questions about that, the Auditor State's website, or give your regional audit or local government services a call if you have some specific questions after reviewing that information. How you set up now, how it relates to the appropriation budget, how you set up the appropriation budget, in part determines you as a fiscal officer, your legal level of control when making, if it's needed to make changes to that budget throughout the year, and what various authorizations you use for certain things. So that, by the way, that appropriation budget or ordinance is something that you prepare outside of the UEN software system. Just like the amended certificate is not something that's produced, you don't print out the amended certificate from the UEN software. You don't print out the appropriation budget from the UEN software. You enter the budget into the UEN software once you have it, once that's in place, but you do not, there's no, within UEN, you're not printing an official document to use for that purpose. And how you do that budget could vary, at least with the appropriations, depending on the entity and how you set your legal level of control, which brings us back to the website, the Auditor State's website. As I mentioned at the beginning of the class, a good discussion on the legal level control and how you set up your budgets can be found under Publications in the Publications menu, and I already mentioned this, there's the Village Officers Handbook and the Ohio Township's Handbook, and I mentioned I can't remember right now, but the back of those books in the appendix, I believe, you can find the actual account labeled as Accounting Manual. You can look at under the self-training resources for that, but you'll find a discussion of that and how you set up your budgets, how that plays into your legal level of control. You'll also find a discussion on that in the handouts under the most recent Local Government Officials Conference, released here in the 2011 one. A good one to look at is Ohio Budgetary Law. There's some discussion there in the speaker handouts about your legal level control and how that is set in relation to the appropriation budget. And a number of the other ones that I mentioned have information there, basic accounting and so forth. All right, so I'll leave it at that. We'll get back to our book. Here's an overview, a very brief overview compared to the F1 help. I'm not sorry, not F1 help. It's under the Need Help button. You can find if we go to the menu path, and your book is Accounting, Maintenance, Appropriation Budgets. Click on Need Help. It'll open up a more extensive overview for appropriations. But in summary, we'll read over the summary here in our handbook class, and I'll just read that. The appropriation budget is the amount that the entity expects to spend on each appropriation account, the line item for each account code for the year. An annual appropriation ordinance must be passed by April 1st of each year for the period of January through December 31st. So in other words, the entire year. By April 1st, everyone has to have an appropriation budget entered. The entity must have appropriations adopted to legally spend money. So we, like I said, we're not the authorities on this, but we enforce some of the rules where we can, based on what Audit LGS has told us to do. A temporary appropriation ordinance to control expenditures may be passed, keyword is may be passed, on or about January 1st of each year for the period of January through March. So in other words, the first quarter. This is optional. If it's needed for your entity, you can pass a temporary appropriation and enter that in UAN. The temporary appropriation budget amounts can be an estimate of what will be spent for up to the first 3 months. A little redundant there. However, the permanent appropriation budget amounts must be an estimate of what is spent for the entire year. And I think the point there, as we'll see, is that the permanent, even if you choose to use a temporary budget for the first 3 months, when you enter your permanent budget, that should cover the entire 12 months. So it's replacing the temporary. It's not adding to the temporary. And we'll see how that works in the software. So I'll be touching on these highlights as we go through. Our first exercise is to add a temporary appropriation budget. So I'll follow that. And as you can see, I don't have any appropriation budget set up yet for our funds. Now the menu path again is Accounting, Maintenance, and then Appropriation Budgets. It opens up this area. And like with all the other areas, the Add button is there for you to add anything new to that area. So we'll click on Add. And this is a little different. It shows you a drop-down menu for temporary and permanent appropriations. Now, temporary is optional. Again, the reason you might use the temporary appropriation option is if your board or council does not approve your permanent original budget for the year until maybe a few months out. Okay, so they've got their deadline is by the end of March 31st, but so they're meeting their deadline, but they don't get that permanent appropriation approved until, let's say, the end of February, for instance. Well, you still have bills to pay between January and the end of February, and without having some appropriations in place, the UN system will enforce the rule and will not allow you to make any payments unless you've got an appropriation for current year payments. So a solution to that is to set up an appropriation, a temporary approval for a temporary appropriations for the first 3 months. If you don't need that, maybe your board passes it, January 5th, and so you're ready to go, begin the year. You can skip right to a permanent, and you don't have to use this. But we're going to assume we need a temporary ordinance, and it gives you a little reminder. Actually, you won't see this if you do it on time. Remember, in reality, I'm in August here, so I've got to backdate everything, and so it's telling me, hey, this should be really dated before April 1st. Actually, where the temporary or permanent, you got to have your appropriations in before April 1st. So I'm going to click OK on that. And then this is a normal message you'll see. It says temporary appropriations can be entered only once per fund. All subsequent changes must be made by reallocations or supplementals. Well, that's exercise 3 and 4, and that's these 2 buttons down here. We'll talk about that. And then you've seen this before in the last lesson. The resources available for appropriation report is a good reference. It gives you the menu path there. So I'll click OK. And now it opens my Add Temporary Appropriation Budget form. And the first thing I want to do is pick the fund from this list. So click on that arrow. It opens up the drop-down menu. Excuse me. And so those are all of my funds, right, that I could set up appropriation budgets for. So we're just going to pick on Road and Bridge today. And so we'll select Road and Bridge. And I've got a very limited sample list of, I just picked some accounts almost randomly for Road and Bridge and threw them in here. So we got a nice short list for Road and Bridge for appropriations. So here's the account code, the account name, the current year final appropriation. Well, we haven't entered anything yet. The unencumbered balance, well, if we had later on we create purchase orders and blanket certificates, that's going to encumber some of our appropriations. In other words, obligate those for specific purposes, obligate that budget amount. So we haven't encumbered anything yet, so that's 0. And then these 2 columns over here correspond to the first 2 here. So once I make a revision in this column, it'll update these 2. The revised current year final appropriation, revised unencumbered balance. This column is your data entry column, and as you can see, it's titled Temporary Appropriation Q1, as in the first quarter only. All right, down here we've seen this in the last lesson. We had, when we did revenues, we have the current year final revenue budget. Well, remember, if you look back on page 24 of the book, that's from our, that $60,000 is the total of our, for Road and Bridge, total of our taxes and other sources, or sources of revenue. And then the resources available for appropriation, the $101,000, that corresponds to your amended certificate, the total amount available for appropriations. That's our ceiling, the amount we can appropriate in this fund. And that, of course, includes the $60,000 plus our January 1st unencumbered cash balance of the year. All right, so we've seen that before, but here's the new fields. The current year final appropriation, well, that corresponds to this. Currently it's 0. And then whatever we enter here will be we'll update our revised final appropriation. So on our exercise number 1, I'm going to enter in some amounts. So again, this would be, well, I'll just enter these in, 5,000. As you can see, it'll update this column and it starts totaling the fund down here. I press enter to move through the rows. Type in the amount, press enter, type in the amount, oops, mistake, so backspace, press enter, If I make a mistake, I can click over here and type it in again. And now we can see our total for this fund is $8,000 just for our first quarter. And then we're going to put in the date of January 1st for this, 2011. I suppose that could vary for your temporary appropriations. It says on or about January 1st. Now, what we're going to see as we go through the next exercise, that this amount, it's for the first quarter. Let's assume, this is a good example. It's not going to work out as clean as this example I'm going to show you, but for this account code, this is for salaries. Let's assume that these employees get paid out of this salary account and they get paid an actual salary, a set amount every month for 12 months. So you're budgeting for the first quarter, and it happens to total up to $5,000. So your total for the year, if you go quarter, multiply that by 4, it's going to be a total of $20,000. So we're just entering in the first quarter here of $5,000, and we'll see in the next example how we'll update that for the full year. All right, so I'm going to save this fund, and it gives me a little confirmation at the bottom that it's now saved temporary appropriations, and I can move on to the next fund. Notice that 2031 no longer shows up. If I go back here, let's say I need to make some edits to my temporary appropriations. Notice I got to go through these messages. It doesn't show up on my list. So once you enter a temporary or permanent appropriation, you can't make changes to it using that add button. We'll talk about that further. But let's move on to exercise number 2. And that's to add permanent appropriations for the Road and Bridge Fund. So we're going to assume that some time's passed, and now on January 10th, our permanent original full year appropriation ordinance was authorized, and we're going to enter those amounts in UAN. So to do that, again, we can't add it to, or we can't add it here. I'm sorry, we wouldn't add it to temporary. We can't. There's no edit button, is what I'm really meant to say. You can't go here and edit these appropriations. You can see here that it's temporary. What you do is you replace that fund's temporary appropriations with permanent appropriations. So I click on Add Permanent. It gives me the same type of message I had before. I click OK. And here, the Road and Bridge Fund does show up because I don't have a permanent appropriations for this fund yet. So I'll select Road and Bridge, and we'll have the exact same column headings as I did before, with the exception of our data entry field. Here now, that column is labeled permanent/original, a full year, for full 12 months. My sections below here are identical. We got 60,101 for resources available still, of course. And then our current year final appropriation, well, that's reading this column here, the final appropriation. This is totaling that column, so it's still 8,000 for temporary. In reality, this unencumbered balance would not equal your current year final because that's the whole purpose of your temporary. So you would have made some payments, or at least you would have encumbered some purchase orders or blank certificates. You paid some salaries, so you would have had encumbered some amount. So this would be lower than your final appropriation in most likelihood. But this is just things, just that we just did it right away, so obviously it's equal. So now one thing you have to do is fill in your effective date. We know that this was approved on January 10th, so we'll put in January 10th, 2011. Oops. And then we'll enter in our permanent original budget for the full year. Since this is replacing our $5,000 temporary budget, remember I said it's $20,000 total for the year. Well, we don't want to enter in $15,000. If I do that, notice what happens. It just gives me a full year final appropriation of $15,000. That's not what I want. In my budget, I actually have $20,000 for the full year. And so I'll replace the $5,000 temporary with $20,000. Then you continue on. Obviously, many of your expenses are not going to be an even amount of, $5,000 per quarter. There's one thing I didn't point out yet that is different than the temporary screen, and it's this Import Current Temps button. And you can see the description here. It says, click to copy the current year final appropriation amounts into the permanent original full year column. So if I click this, it's saying that it's going to copy these amounts into this column. Well, why would I want to do that? Well, you're not going to want to do that very often. This is just for those rare situations, probably not your general fund or some of the main funds that you use, but maybe for a few funds where your temporary budget, your first quarter equals your full year of expenditures. In other words, everything you're going to spend for that year, you plan to spend for the year, is expected to be spent in the first quarter. And so you set up your temporary budgets that way, and it's going to equal your permanent budget. In that case, this would be useful. In all other cases, the numbers are going to be different. So most likely you're not going to use that. The other scenario would be maybe you've got 20 account codes in this fund, and maybe 5 of those 20 have, you're going to spend, you expect to spend that money in the first quarter. And so you could use this button. It'll copy all the amounts for all 20, and then you could just type over that field for the amounts that are wrong and leave the ones that are right. So it's just there to save you a little bit of data entry. But I'll go ahead and click on that just so you can see how that works. Click it once, and that's all there is to it. Again, most cases you're not really going to have a need to do that because you're going to need to put in the first 12 months, revise it with the first 12 months anyways. All right, so back to exercise number 2. I'll type in those amounts real quick. Oops. If I miss it, I can just use the mouse to get back up to that row. All right, I'm going to temporarily, or I should say intentionally, leave out some amounts on here so that we can do exercise 3 and 4, okay? Or exercise 3 and make some corrections. So I'm intentionally making a mistake here. And I'm going to save this. And it gives me this system message. It's not an error, just information. It says, please note the permanent appropriation you've entered for this fund, 2031, will be marked as the original appropriation. So it should match, the total should match the amounts on your original appropriation for that fund on the ordinance or resolution. In addition, the current final revenue budget for the fund will also be marked as the original revenue budget. So this would be your original revenue budget, the amended certificate that's in place as of this time. Excuse me again. So it gives you the amount. So remember that taxes plus other sources, $60,000 there. It's the original budget. It's going to designate that now as the original budget on your reports. The original appropriation amount is $32,000. It's right there. And then the effective date. If you're not sure, cancel, and you can go back to it, or click OK, and it'll make it so. You get your confirmation message at the bottom of the screen, and then you can continue on with other funds. Notice 2031 is no longer on my list of funds to pick. All right, so now what do you do after, let's assume we entered all of our budget amounts for all of our funds. What's the step to verify that we did everything correctly in UAN? Well, if we flip to the back of our section here to the checklist, we've got a good thing here with the checklist number 1. So what you want to do is check that your final appropriation budget equals the amount on your voted resolution or ordinance for the year. Now remember, based on all that information I refer to on the AutoState's website, you could prepare that ordinance in different ways, and so depending on the level of detail you look at, you may only be able to look. You might not have done this ordinance in the same level of detail that you entered it into the UAN system. I'll leave that to you to go review that information. But for the total amounts and for some level of detail, you're going to be looking at your ordinance and comparing it to your appropriation budget that you entered in UAN, the count codes. And you can do that by looking at, going to the appropriation status. I think it would also be helpful if you first look at the comparison of budget and appropriated, and there's the menu path for that. On that page, you can circle those two on page 29. So let's look at those reports real briefly. Now remember, we're going to go over reports later, so I'm just going to zip through opening them, but you can and browsing through them. But you've got the menu path, so we're just going to use the related links here, screens here I should say. And if I click on budgetary reports, that'll get me to my comparison of budget versus appropriated. I'll just select the Road and Bridge Fund, because that's all we have appropriated, and display it. It's a one-page report, and this is identical to that resources available for appropriation report, except for the last two columns, final appropriation and variance. So remember, so that this $32,000 in fact does match our total for the fund. If we look back, actually I should look back at our appropriation budget. Well, there's the $32,000 current year final appropriation. I can look in here, $32,000. And then remember that $101,000, that represents the, these are all zeros, so it comes out to be, there's no adjustment, so it's still $41,000, our ending for 2010, beginning balance of January 1st, 2011, $41,000. You add those two up to taxes and other sources, and you got your estimated resources of 101, which corresponds to this. So if this matches our ordinance, I'm going to say it does, the $32,000, then we're in good shape. We can also see the variance. 101 minus 32,000 is 69,000. So we'll see the relevance of that in a little bit. It's quite a variance, I know, for this fund. We're appropriating very little of what we have available to appropriate, but it's just an example. All right, so let's say we look at that example and we find that it is that 32,000 is wrong. If we look at our ordinance or resolution that we voted on, it's 33,000 or it's 30,000 or 60,000. Well, what do we do? Well, we want to investigate further by going to the appropriation status report. And again, that's on page 29, the menu path. But I'll use the shortcut here under appropriation reports. And I'll go to the appropriation status. And I'm just going to select the road and bridge, account codes. Normally you'd probably select all. And I'll display that. So this is one of our Big Six reports, and it's an excellent report. I'll just show you some of the fields that are relevant here. So you got your accounts, your account descriptions for that fund. It's subtotaled by fund. And there's our $32,000. Final appropriation. So you're going to compare that to the, at least by the total and to the detail that you have in your ordinance voted resolution, and figure out where you went wrong. Did you forget to key something in? Should you have typed in 40,000 instead of 20,000? Where was the error made? And then you can go back and correct the amounts for each fund. So once you determine if you made any errors, maybe it's perfect, and hey, that's great. Then you can, but if you find that you've made errors, now's the time to review and make corrections before you go on with making payments and so forth. So if I go back to the software and take a look at my appropriation budgets, and by the way, I think this is the first time I've been doing this that much. Remember from the screencast overview you watched at the beginning of class, we've got the various tabs, and I'm flipping through. I still have all these reports areas open. I can keep them open and go to my appropriation budgets, and at the same time, go back and forth between those two or three. So how do you make changes? Well, I said there's no edit button. There's the supplemental and reallocate button. Well, we'll get to the supplemental button in a little bit. I mean the reallocate button. The supplemental, just like with revenues, you can use this supplemental button for two different things. You can, and what we're going to, in our example, we're going to correct transcription errors, key-in errors, or typing omissions in our original budget. So we'll do that first. I'll click on supplemental, and again, all of our column headings and most of this is identical to what we've seen in the other screens, except for this column, the supplemental plus and minus. So here we can enter in a positive or a negative number, and I'll just enter in a few that are not in the book to start off. Like, for instance, with the $20,000 here for our other salaries budget, I could enter in minus $10,000, and it reduces my final appropriation to $10,000. Or a better example would be something a little bit that's not even, maybe minus 6,000, whatever, 6,000, reduces it to 14,000 from 20. And our example calls for increases, so in the book we're going to say, well, this should have been, I should have keyed in 22,000. I just typed it wrong. My mistake, that happens all the time. You can make that correction here. And you can correct multiple account codes. Well, there's nothing wrong with tax collection fees, but repairs and maintenance, that should have been 10,000. I forgot to type in a 0. Oops, fat fingered it. So I don't type in 10,000 here. That would be wrong because that's going to increase it to 11,000. So this acts a little bit differently than the other screen now. In the other screen, you typed in for your permanent budget, it was a replacement, right? So you typed in the total amount. And here, it's a plus or minus, an increase or a decrease. So here, I am going to type in the difference. I really wanted this to be 10,000, not 1,000. So I'm going to type in the difference of 9,000. So the screens act a little bit differently here. You can tell basically by this little hint here, or really you can tell by looking at the revision on this side. So type in 9,000, and now that's my desired budget for the year of 10,000. And then the last one is contracted services. Well, no, nothing wrong with that. We're going to say we completely forgot to put in the amount for operating supplies, and that should have been 14,000. So that increases my total current year final appropriation to, went from 32,000 to 77,000. And so that was wrong, and I can see my error of my ways. I made the same mistake that I'm warning you against, is that it really should be, I wanted to increase this from 20 to 22,000, and so I don't type in 22, I type in 2,000. And that adds to the amount of my appropriation. All right, so now my budget went, because of these additions, my budget went from 32,000 total to 57,000 total. Still pretty low as far as it's only about 60% of my total resources available. All right, so my effective date is going to, because this is a correction, I'm just going to put in the same date as my original resolution. I just typed it in wrong. It wasn't we're not adding and doing, we didn't have another resolution to change the budget. So it's January 10th, 2011, just like my original budget resolution. And if I want, I could put in some, optionally put in some notes about, oops, I made an error here, etc. But what's really going to tell your auditors that this was an error and not a true budget change is by selecting this Apply as Correction checkbox. Works just the same way as revenues. I click on that, it tells me that when I fill in this checkbox, the supplemental budgets you have entered will be applied to the fund's original budgets and will not be reflected on supplemental budgets that you display on the display form or on budgetary reports. So I don't want them to be displayed as a separate budget item, so I'm going to fill in that checkbox and say, yeah, that's good. So that should only be used if you just typed in something wrong or failed to type it in on your original budget. However, if it was a true budget change, like later in the year, let's say in June, you can see right here that we didn't appropriate our entire resources available to appropriation. Our amended certificate says we could appropriate $101,000. So maybe in June, your board decides, hey, let's plan to spend more of that money on some other expenses for the rest of the year. We'll authorize you to spend another $20,000. If you have a true budget supplemental change, then you would clear this checkbox when you made these changes. You would not fill it in, and it would be, your auditors would see on budgetary reports that this was, as they should, that this was a budgetary change mid-year or later in the year. That's fine. So I'm going to save this because this was just a key and arrow as a correction, and then close the form. All right, so that's how we made some corrections, and again, later in the year, if we had a true budgetary change, let's say sometime in August, let's say, we would increase our amounts, or increase or decrease amounts. I'm just going to do this and show you. We could do this, and we would not click on that checkbox. If we completed this, I'm not going to save it. If we completed it, then when we go to display or go to certain reports, we would see the sum of those for the year under this supplemental column. As it is, when I increase this budget from 20 to 22, because I filled in the Apply as Correction checkbox, it just shows it as the original budget because I just made a key in error. But true supplementals will show up under this column. All right, well, what about this Reallocate button? Well, what's that about? Well, with the Reallocate button, you do have to select the fund again. You can't add a reallocation. That's when you don't use that for corrections, and you don't use that for true supplemental budget changes. You use it for budget changes that involve moving appropriations between one account code and another account code within the same fund. That's also referred to, as it says at the beginning of the chapter, as an intra-fund appropriation transfer. And so you're not going to change your total. This $50,000, $7,000 will not change when you record a reallocation. It's just a matter of moving that amounts between the line items within the fund. For that, you use the Reallocation button. So if I click on this, if I look in my exercise on page on page 28 and 29, I'm going to reallocate a number of account codes. Well, I'll choose. It's August, so I could choose today's date. By the way, a nice little shortcut for picking today's date is by clicking on this red box next to today. If I click anywhere else, you'll select the date. But if I want to click today's date, I just click on this little box, and it automatically fills in the date of your current calendar day. So in here, notice all the columns are identical except it says interfund. It's an interfund increase or decrease to each account code. And notice that my current year final appropriation, $57,000, $57,000. Now if I enter this transaction in, 1,000 increase to this fund, or this account code I should say, then a negative 1,000 here, oops, should be 1,000, I got to correct that, not 100, minus 1. Page 29, that stays the same, but then I'm going to reduce this account code. So apparently we're saying, well, we need a little bit more appropriations in these two account codes for expenses, but we have a little extra in these two account codes. So we're reducing some and increasing others. But in the end result, it's the total fund appropriations have not changed. 57, 57. There's no appropriations haven't changed for that fund. We're just moving it around within line items. Again, referring back to the Auditor State's website, those resources, or depending on your legal level of control, you may or may not need a resolution for this. These fields are optional, but it depends on your level of control. So we're going to save this, and we can see that it does change our appropriations. Click on Save and close. If I come back to Display, I can see under Intrafund that I made a true budgetary change to my my Road and Bridge Fund. Now, I'll show you something that's outside the book. Let's say I try to do this. I'll type in minus 2,000 here. I'll just pick today's date to demonstrate. Say, okay, I clicked on the Reallocate button for Road and Bridge, so I'm trying to perform an intra-fund transfer, and I've got minus 2,000. I try to save that. It's going to blow up on me and give me an error message. It says, reallocations cannot change the current year final appropriation. It's not going to let me save this. And why is that? Well, it can't change the final year appropriation, the total for the fund. So if this 57,000, if I try to do this, it's going to reduce it to 55,000. And that is not an intra-fund budgetary change. It's not moving from line item with account codes without affecting the total of the fund. It would affect the total of the fund. So this would not allow me to do so. If I were to type in positive 2,000 somewhere else and try to save this, it'll allow me to save it because these two amounts equal. But I'm not going to do that. I won't save the changes. The same thing applies to supplemental budget change. If I have a true supplemental budget change, again, I could, in August, let's say, I would leave this checkbox blank, and maybe I'm increasing this, got a resolution if I need it for my legal level of control. If needed, I would put it in there. But let's say I'm increasing this account code by 2,000. I could save it and allow me to save it, and it would show as a true budgetary change. I've already said that. But what if I try to do something like this? It's going to blow up on me again. The supplemental amounts you have entered sum to 0. Supplemental budgets must change the fund's current final appropriation. To move appropriations between accounts in the fund, enter a reallocation instead. In other words, use this button because it's not really the same thing. It's not an intra-fund. What you're trying to do is an intra-fund transfer here, reallocation, and you've entered it in as a supplemental change. So again, for the supplemental, these two amounts should not agree. It should be a total increase or a total decrease. So again, this would work, an increase or decrease to the final appropriation for the fund. All right, so that's about it for the appropriation budgets. I want to show you one other thing. This is kind of a little extra here in your checklist. I said I wasn't going to go through these checklists very much, but this is really a good one to look at. Number 2 here on page 29. Does your final appropriation budget total for each fund exceed the total available to appropriate on the amended certificate of estimated resources from your county auditor? So let's remember our amended certificate from the county auditor for the Road and Bridge Fund is saying the total available to appropriate. So we go back to that, chapter back. There's our amended certificate for Road and Bridge. The total available for appropriation is $101,000. That's on our latest amended certificate as the time we make this budget. That's our ceiling. That's the maximum we should spend by law out of this fund during this fiscal year, unless we get a change to unless we have another change to our amended certificate. So what is that? That's the cash that you have on hand in that fund that's unencumbered at the beginning of the year, January 1st, plus your taxes, your revenue budget, your taxes and other sources, what you expect to receive for the rest of the year. That sets your ceiling, the maximum you should, you're authorized, and tongue-tied here, I'll take a sip of water, authorized to spend or to by law out of that fund. So I go back to our checklist. It says that does your appropriations, your authorization to spend out of this fund, does it exceed the total available on your amended certificate? Well, a great way to check that after you enter in these budget amounts to make sure that you didn't make a mistake, again, is your comparison right here, how to verify. Check the variances between the total revenue and the appropriations on the comparison of budgeted versus appropriated. Well, I think I still have that open somewhere on my computer here for revenue. For the budget, I can even, this is before I made some changes, but let's even look at that. Let's run it again after my changes. So if I go to budgetary reports, still open, select Road and Bridge, display. There's the beginning fund cash balance, no adjustments to that for encumbrances, carryover for the year. My estimated revenue is $60,000. My total estimated budget is resources $101,000. Nothing's changed there. My final appropriation is $57,000. I've got $44,000 that I have not appropriated. That's what that variance means. So technically, if my board approves it, I could appropriate up to another $44,000. So I have not exceeded my ceiling, my maximum for this fund of $101,000 because I have a positive amount here. So as long as this variance is positive or zero, if it was zero, that would mean my final appropriation was $101,000, equaling this. As long as it's positive or zero, I'm okay, I guess. But if I see a negative in this variance, that's a big red flag that you need to check into a problem, that you need to do something about that. If I see a negative right here, that means basically what I'm telling my citizens is that our township, we're planning to spend more money than we started off with and that we expect to receive for the year. And you can imagine your auditors will have a problem with that, and your citizens might have a problem with that too, I imagine. You're trying to spend more than you bring in or start with. So you want to resolve that. So if we go back to our book, what happens if you see that that's negative? Well, the next thing you do, the first thing you might want to do if this is the beginning of the year, well, any time, is that you want to check your revenue budget amounts. Maybe you did something wrong there. You keyed in the wrong amount. And we already went over that in the last section on revenue budgets, but that's basically checking that this report, checking the revenue, the amounts on this report, comparison of budget appropriated. Does that match up? Is if for total to your amended certificate? If not, check the revenue status. Does it match up there? And then if not, you enter some supplemental budget changes with an apply as correction checkbox to fix it. Well, let's say maybe you fix a problem, but you still have a negative variance on that comparison report. You're spending more than you bring in, is what the budget says. Well, then check the appropriation account budget amounts to determine if a variance is due to a data entry problem in appropriations. So I didn't read here. First, we're checking to see if it's just a data entry problem for our revenues. If we find a data entry problem, we can correct it, as we did in the last lesson. If we find appropriation account budget amount that's a data entry problem, well, we're going to check that using this comparison report, and then the appropriation status report, and we'll look at the line items there. I'm sorry, go back to the appropriation status, look at our final appropriation amount on our appropriation status report, and see if we made any errors here. This is an old version, but these would be updated. If we found that we appropriated too much on one of these account codes, we just keyed it in wrong, then again we can correct our data entry errors. Excuse my flipping around here. We can correct our data entry errors using that apply as correction checkbox, this time in the supplemental screen in the appropriation maintenance. So we've had demonstrations of all that as well. If there are no data entry errors input in the system, and it appears the entity is stating that the appropriation ordinance on the appropriation ordinance resolution that it's planning to spend more than a total available resources for that fund as stated on the amended certificate of estimated resources. This situation should be resolved. At that point, you want to consult your board and council. You want to discuss how to resolve this, discuss a resolution, or discuss it with your county auditor. Maybe you need an amended certificate. You really actually need an amended certificate. Maybe you are expecting more. You really are expecting, you have a higher ceiling. Maybe you should get more than the amount as stated on the latest amended certificate. So either way, you want to resolve that problem because you don't want to state in your appropriation budget that you're spending more than you actually receive or that you actually have in the year. Okay, so that's kind of my soapbox there. The next section is investment maintenance.